start the session.
Yeah, I think we should start now.
Yes.
Yeah. Friends, we are honored to have with us Dr. Ajay Mathur, who's the Director General of the International Solar Alliance, ISA. A coalition of 89 member countries, the ISA, strives to accelerate the demand for and use of safe, sustainable, and affordable solar energy for all. Before joining ISA, Dr. Mathur was the Director General of the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI. You remember we had Annapurna ji from TERI day before yesterday in our panel, and it was she who was instrumental in connecting me to Dr. Mathur. So I'm grateful to her for this presence of Dr. Mathur. Dr. Mathur has also held leadership appointments at the Bureau of Energy Efficiency and the Green Climate Fund. He was appointed a Chevalier d'Ordre National du Mérite by the President of France in recognition of his outstanding commitment to the preservation of environment and coping with energy-related challenges. Well, friends, on this day, the 117th birth anniversary of J.R.D. Tata, we have with us our special guest of honor to address us, the conference participants, the entire IIM Shillong fraternity, and all the 250 students. Dr. Ajay Mathur. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mukherjee, Professor Kakoti, and all the students and all other participants in this conference. First of all, a very good evening to you. If you're in Shillong, if you're in other parts of the world, then a very, very good day to you. It's a great honor to be with you at Suscon. Professor Kakoti was mentioning the merger of the sustainability module that all the students are required to go through with this conference. I think that's a great idea because sharing of how this is practiced comes out in the conference. The issue of sustainability is far more a matter of emerging practice than it is of established knowledge. And there was nobody better who portrays the emergence of sustainability as a business idea than the late J.R.D. Tata. We celebrate his birth anniversary today. This is the man who committed the Tata Group to sustainability. And if you read any of his writings or his biography of him, all of them focus on the fact that for J.R.D., a corporation existed for the community around it. The corporation existed obviously for the shareholders, but to him, unless it provided benefits to its direct and indirect indirect stakeholders, it wasn't doing its job. There is the oft-repeated mantra put forward by you come back to me, the famous Chicago Milton Friedman, who said that the business of business is business. I don't think so. I think, as in many other things, Milton Friedman carried things to an extreme. A business exists as a social compact. It's a social compact between the people who invest in it, between the people who buy its products, and the country and the world as a whole within which it exists as some kind of a regulated entity. Now, many of these issues, many companies will argue that the regulations that exist define the boundaries of what is it that they can and cannot do. And for example, the fact that companies in India are now required to put 2% of their profits into corporate social responsibility. It seems to them that that is, again, the limit of what they have to do. I will argue that sustainability is much more. That it means different things to different people. That it is in corporate self-interest to look at sustainability within the lens of that company's place in society. And that as we go ahead, we need to promote ways to accelerate this interaction, the interaction which promotes sustainability between companies and society. The short point that I'd like to leave you with is sustainability is not a fixed goalpost. The concept of sustainability changes over time. It changes over time, both as far as a company is concerned, its own expectations, the expectations of its shareholders, but also in legal terms. You know, as little as 50 years ago, there were almost no requirements regarding environmental protection anywhere in the world. 100 years ago, when Tata Steel introduced the world's first social protection systems, it was seen as if the company is getting into things that are not in the domain of a company. But yet, whether it be corporate social or corporate environmental acts, today those are seen as being separate. The first message that I'd like to leave with you is that the concepts of sustainability evolve, and companies can decide they will always be first movers. So depending on where a company wants to be, it can be a first mover or it can move with the herd. It could even be a laggard. But there are obviously both costs and benefits associated with each of these strategies. And this is what I will talk about in the next half an hour or so. So let's look at these benefits. What are these benefits? One of the biggest benefits is the fact that sustainability enhances competitiveness and shareholder value. How? Let me give you an example. In the early 2000s, I think it was 2006 or so, when I was heading the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, one of the major steel companies introduced a, we had brought out, we were at that point, we had not yet brought out, we were still in the process of consulting with industry on standards for efficient electrical devices, those which are captured by the star rating today. We are still working on this. And one steel company came out with what they called as electrical steel. It was a different kind of steel. But with electrical steel, achieving the kinds of efficiencies that the Bureau was talking about became much easier. And it completely changed the game. The view of companies making refrigerators, air conditioners, transformers suddenly changed because this company not only provided them with the raw material, but also provided some hand-holding in how do you design these products. Now, this was not a one-way process. Many of these companies were demanding electrical steel. Many of them had been importing electrical steel. So it was not as if it occurred in a vacuum. But the point that an Indian company went out of its way, invested in the creation of this, helped in producing sustainability across the board. The second issue that I would like to focus on is recycling. If you look at recycling, how has that occurred? Now, in many industries, we are now seeing, for example, there are already recycling requirements, for example, for batteries. One can always argue that, listen, I threw off my battery, or I gave my battery when I got a new battery for my car, the fellow took the old battery and probably pulled it in a drain. But whatever it is, a system exists. Today, 90% of the batteries produced in India do make it back to a recycling station, either in the battery factory or somewhere else. And this number was 0 in 2005. So in a matter of 16 years, we have seen the evolution of the lower use of new material, new lead, new battery casings as compared to what we had in the past. Why? For several reasons. One, of course, is that it is becoming very, very difficult to throw a battery which has acid into a landfill. It leaches into the landfill, it creates into the water between the landfill and creates an undesirable and insecure environment for you and I. But more importantly, for the companies, what has also happened is that virgin lead costs more. If you look at aluminum, we are seeing 100% recycling. Why? Because making aluminum is a very energy intensive process. It requires a lot of electricity. And therefore, if you can collect all those aluminum cans and can melt them, well, you've got aluminum which is much cheaper, not only in money terms, but in terms of effort as well, as compared to raw materials. So that's another reason why companies are going in for a greater amount of recycling. So companies focus on these for a variety of reasons. And I've spoken of 3, that policies and regulations are a driver. They keep on evolving. I've spoken of the need to reduce virgin material and improve recycled material. And I've spoken of green marketing. All of those become important. Let me put up a slide here which captures what I said. And I have no idea whether you can see the slide or not. If you can.
Yes, we can see.
Oh, okay, lovely, lovely, lovely. So the first point that I'd like to leave you with is that sustainability is becoming extremely important. I have no idea how to change this slide. You're still seeing the title slide, Sustainability Matters, or have you moved to slide 1?
No, it's the title slide. It's the title slide, sir.
Yeah. I'm trying to see how I can change it. Yes. Okay. I hope you can see the first slide, which is capturing what I have just said. That
right.
This is a necessity for business. So this is what I would like to leave you with. That far from being an onerous responsibility, sustainability is becoming a business necessity. And it is changing day by day. So we need to have an eye on the future as we look at sustainability.
I think some unexpected issue has cropped up, so please bear with us.
Right, sir.
are to change over to another internet, and that has taken a little bit of time.
Absolutely no problem, sir.
Okay, let me see how I can get the screen back. Right. I hope you can see.
Yes, yes, we are back to where we left off, sir.
Okay. So the point that I was making is all of these things are important, and that green businesses, green firms are therefore more future ready than non-green firms. They are better prepared for growth opportunities. You think of that company which created electric steel. Yes, that cost it produced, the cost put it in making electric steel could have gone down the drain. But instead, together with smart marketing, together with an eye on where the regulations are going, it actually led to risk reduction, not only for themselves, but for a lot of other people who are manufacturing air conditioners, refrigerators, transformers, etc. Therefore, stakeholder engagement becomes important. I would then like to move to, okay, if that is the case, well, doesn't doing good, for example, investing in making electric steel, clash with doing well, because you're putting this money in and that money may not give you the benefits that is needed. So many firms, many managers do see green as a distraction. So, this goes back to the Friedman quotation I had used earlier, that the only responsibility of business is business. Now, the problem is that a firm's activities actively impinge, and often impinge negatively, on others with whom it does not do business. If it does business, that's okay. So if I am located somewhere and I'm producing effluents, those effluents are impacting all the people who are living around. Even if, okay, I put in an effluent treatment plant, I live by the rules of the Ministry of Environment, even then, the roads which lead to my factory are so busy that people who live near me find it difficult to reach there. You only have to drive from Delhi to Simbauli and see in the sugar crushing season how the road is jammed with tractor trolleys full of sugar cane. Other people have a problem. And yet you can think of these examples by the millions. The short point is that with people not being willing to accept these negative consequences, we need to see how we can move ahead. Now, clearly green production may be perceived as a high risk change. Yes, of course. What it means is that when you are taking on new technologies by themselves don't matter. What really matters is the operating practices and the stakeholder engagement. This is where a company needs to carry its own employees and its stakeholders with it. Let me give you a very small, a very minor example. Many years ago, it must have been, I think it was 2015, we've just come back from Paris after the Paris COP, and at that point of time, many companies were asking us to come and tell them about what does the Paris Agreement mean for them. And one of the companies which had invited us was Reliance Industries in Jamnagar. And they gave a little notebook on which I was making notes. The interesting thing was that on the inner cover of the notebook was written internally, what is the cost of water? What is the cost of steam? What is the cost of electricity? Therefore, whenever one section deals with another, they know what is the internal costing they're talking about. If they save on water, if they save on steam, if they save on electricity, if they improve energy efficiency or water efficiency, they know what is the kind of savings that they're doing themselves. In a very simple way, the message of energy efficiency was passed to all. I will argue that these kinds of communications, and the sky is the limit for innovation as far as communications is concerned, that this becomes extremely important as you move towards sustainability, because everybody has to have a common goal towards which they are moving. So, for example, 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Reliance Industry announced that they're going to move away from petroleum, which has been their basis for so many years, and move towards solar, batteries, electrolyzers for making hydrogen, fuel cells for using hydrogen. Completely different business model. Now, unless they are able to carry all their workers with them, it will become very difficult. Because these guys will say, this is what we've been doing all these years, and you're telling us we were doing wrong. Consequently, an internal messaging is important. Now, I haven't discussed this with them, I don't know, but I would be reasonably sure that there must be an active internal messaging that must be going along. There are many, many companies which have focused on moving as far as sustainability are concerned. I think the greatest, I've given you some of the examples. The greatest example in a very a good framework, corporate-wide framework, is that produced by the Tata companies, who look at both CEO leadership on the one side and what they call as an architecture on the other side. So how is it that we will implement? CEOs provide the lead, but it's not just that they're saying things, it's also translated into what is it that people will do? How will it change the signals as far as rewards are concerned? How will it change the pricing structure as far as users are concerned? Those kinds of things. How will you deal with your ancillaries, the suppliers of raw materials? All of these become part of that architecture, the framework that they talk about. Similarly, I spoke of a factory and its neighbors. ITC Bhadrachalam is famous for many things, but one of the things that it has done extremely well is encourage the farmers around the paper factory to grow trees. And they say, we will buy the biomass, the trees that you produce, at a particular price. If you can find a better buyer, sure, go ahead. Now, most farmers, 80% of their produce is sold to ITC. As a result, ITC, of course, has got a raw material supply chain, which is the envy of the paper industry. But it also has a very large number of its neighbors who are tied into an economic compact with it. This is one of the examples of how you can help build together these kinds of linkages. What I would suggest is that whether it is by the greater use of renewables or whether it is by the, I'm again trying to change and I'm having great difficulty in changing my screen. None of them are working, so let me continue. I mean, essentially the point that I want to say is, no matter whether it is based on what are today popularly known as nature-based solutions. For example, the kind that happens at ITC Bhadrachalam, or whether it is the energy efficiency standards that many of our electric appliance companies use, or whether it is more renewable energy, or whether it is reuse and recycling. That depends on the company, on what it does. So what sustainability means for an air conditioning company like Voltas will be very different from what it means for a company like Reliance. It will be very different from what it means for JSW. For ITC Bhadrachalam, it has meant something quite different. So defining sustainability for your company becomes important. So that's the second message that I want to leave with, that no matter how quote unquote red the sector is, effective sustainability measures are there. The problem is that while many of these companies, and these are big companies, they've adopted sustainability practices, it is still not something that is widespread. It is carried out by companies. It is in the form of what I would say ripples. And our challenge today is to convert this ripple into a wave. Can it be converted? And again, I seek your indulgence in sharing things that are out of my own experience. So all of you, I'm sure, have bought products, refrigerators, air conditioners, which have the star labels on them. 1 star to 5 star. A 5 star being the most energy efficient, 1 star being the least energy efficient. When we first introduced it in 2007, we were told that the Indian consumer is extremely price sensitive and she will not buy a product which is more expensive, even if it is more energy efficient. We were wasting our time and the time and money of the companies. It is something that went all the way up in the system. And finally, we introduced the standards on a voluntary basis, not on a mandatory basis. But within 18 months, 50% of the air conditioners and 2/3 of the refrigerators that were sold were starred air conditioners and refrigerators, despite the fact that cheaper, non-starred air refrigerators and air conditioners were also available. So what happened? If any of you remember that time, we completely plastered the media with ads. Ads saying that why 5 star is better than 1 star and why a star is better than no star. And the companies that were leading started taking the slots immediately after ours. So for example, if we were going on television, they would talk to Doordarshan and say, we want the slot immediately after the Bureau of Energy Efficiency slot. And therefore, for a consumer, they got more eyeball time. They got the eyeball time of the BE, which says a star is important, and then they got the eyeball time of whichever company, Voltas or whoever it was, which said that they were selling a 5-star air conditioner. But after 18 months, the question of voluntary versus mandatory became academic. And it was at that point of time that we introduced the mandatory system of labeling for refrigerators and air conditioners. And not only that, the way it worked was that we worked out what would be the levels in 2010. We did it a year in advance. What they would be in 2012 and what they would be in 2014. So we negotiated that what was 1 star in 2010 would disappear in 2012. The 5-star would become 4-star in 2012. And similarly in 2014. And since then, it has gone on and on and on. And today, an air conditioner sold in India, the average air conditioner sold in India is 50% more efficient then the air conditioner sold in 2007. In my view, the sustainability has been delivered by industry. But it has meant that the organizations, these companies, their consumers, the government regulators, and most importantly, the supply chain worked together. If they do, it is possible. Now, this is not to say that it was painless. Of course there was, because the relative rankings of the industry changed. But after, say, 2012, 13 or so, we started seeing the kinds of fluctuations that had been occurring earlier. If somebody was giving a discount, they got a greater market in a particular year. If somebody introduced a product which they advertised very widely, they got more the next year, and so on. But what I'd like to leave you with is that it provided us with the capability, with the, what should I say, the confidence that we could work with industry in bringing around sustainability. It was something very similar when the Bureau introduced what is called the Perform, Achieve and Trade program, in which specific energy efficiency increased targets were given to industry. And it was done in a relatively easy manner. We looked at the amount of energy that the company bought in a year. We looked at the total amount of products it sold in a year. And the energy divided by the product became the specific energy consumption, the amount of energy it takes to produce a product. Now, obviously, they produce a range of products. Obviously, they use a range of energies. And therefore, we had to ensure that they were all on a common denominator. And this specific energy consumption had to be decreased by a certain amount, a specified amount over a 3-year period. There was a huge amount of consultation with industry. Industries went in and saw how they would do it. It was ambitious, but it was doable. And consequently, we are today in the 4th cycle of the Perform, Achieve and Trade program. And Indian industry today is amongst the most competitive in terms of energy in the world. I would like to leave you that aggressive outreach, public recognition, and stakeholder involvement are essential parts of a What these companies also did was they incorporated this in their procurement, because the supply chain became greener as well. You ask for green, you deliver green. This became a way to accelerate production. And I mean, I'm talking of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency experience because it's my personal experience. But this is true across many, many other areas as well. I would like to end by focusing on where I am today. I am at the International Solar Alliance, and therefore I ask whether sustainability is possible in the electricity industry. The electricity industry today largely relies on fossil fuels, coal, gas, etc., for the production of electricity, all of which produce carbon dioxide, and we know that the climate change impact on us is increasing. This means that we need to transform our electricity systems. Now, has climate change ever been a political issue in India? In any elections? The answer would be no. But has local environmental quality, the urban air quality in Delhi, or the fact that there is coal moving on trains, or the fact that we import petroleum and this has huge macroeconomic impacts on our budgets, especially in years when you have oil price shocks. Yes, those are concerns. Consequently, it becomes important to relate the larger climate change issue to these here and now issues that you and I face. Most importantly, it is a matter of ensuring that costs become competitive. It's not as if the costs of renewable energy have become competitive. You know, today, solar electricity at 1.99 rupees per kilowatt hour, that's the price that has been found through a bidding process, is the cheapest electricity you can get in India. But it is only available when the sun is shining. When the sun is not shining, in the evening, when we have our electricity peaks, we depend on coal-based electricity because that is the cheapest. But tomorrow, if batteries become cost-effective and we store the electricity produced by solar during the day in those batteries and use them at night, then yes, there is a possibility that we could provide round-the-clock renewable electricity. This is important. But again, as was important with coal, where we found coal in certain parts of the country and then moved the coal across the country for electricity generation, it is equally important that we have an electricity grid which joins all parts of the country. And thankfully, we have that. We have one country, one grid. And that allows solar electricity or wind electricity or any other sustainable electricity to be produced and shared across the country. The point I'd like to leave you with is that the cost reductions that have occurred because of a variety of reasons. But most importantly, they've occurred because of the increasing volumes in which solar electricity has been procured in India and globally. There are days in Germany when the entire production of electricity is from renewables. But they are able to do this because the German grid is connected to the Norwegian grid, and the Norwegian grid is basically a hydroelectric grid. This huge, in a sense, it's a battery. You can store electricity by pumping up water. You can get electricity back by pumping down the water. This has enabled both these countries to become greener. So electricity trade is a great way of ensuring greenness, and interconnections between countries, between regions, therefore become important. But as these prices have fallen, we in India introduced in 2003 the Electricity Act, which said that every electricity distribution company had to buy a certain amount of renewable electricity. And that certain amount was decided by its own regulatory commission. But what it did was that it created volumes. It created a demand. People were willing to invest in manufacturing wind and solar so that because they knew that somebody would buy it. That kept on increasing to the point where, as I mentioned, we are at a point where solar at 1.99 rupees per kilowatt hour and wind at 2.44 rupees per kilowatt hour are much cheaper than coal electricity, even though, as I said earlier, it only occurs when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. The point is, even in a difficult sector like electricity, it is possible to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, certainly well before 2030, probably by 2027, 2028, we will reach the point where electricity from solar plus storage will be cheaper than electricity from fossil fuels. And then you can imagine that there will be no more investment. Banks will be reluctant to provide financing for a more expensive option as opposed to a cheaper option. It helps, therefore, to look at where the trends are going. It helps to look at sustainability. Together, I believe we can make history. I thank you for your attention and would be delighted if you have any questions. I will try to remove the screen, but let me try and see how it happens. Meanwhile, I see there is one hand. Professor Mukherjee, I'll leave it with you to moderate the session. Thank you.
Right. That was indeed fascinating. One of the things that struck my mind is our neighboring country, Bangladesh, has succeeded in increasing their GDP faster than us. And one of the reasons attributed to it is they have advanced their working hours by a few hours. Now, different countries have different time zones. And one of the things that's being done, sir, is to try and maximize the daylight working hours. In the Northeast, in Shillong, where I'm situated, it's daybreak at 4:30 in the morning. And by about 5:30, it's absolutely bright. And the sun sets early. So which means that we are operating at about an hour and a half in advance of the time zone being followed in the rest of the country. And the International Solar Alliance is something that is extremely influential in making government decisions. The need for different time zones in a country like India has always been seen from political lenses. And as a result, we have not been able to maximize the sun shining period for work and for production. So that is a request that comes from the Northeast to you, sir, that in order to increase our use of the solar energy that's there, there might be the need for different time zones in the country. And the sooner we do it, I think it will be better for all of us. So it's a
Thank you very much, Professor Kakuti. This, yes, maximizing solar use and linking working hours with solar is a useful concept. Many years ago, I think 7 or 8 years ago, when I was with the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, we had commissioned a study which was then discussed in great detail at all levels of government, including a consultation with states. And the consultation was led by the then cabinet secretary. The goal at that point of time, this is still the pre-solar period, the goal at that time was that if you change the working hours so that they're more during daylight hours, we reduce the amount of electricity that is used for lighting in workplaces. And we computed that. And, the amount of energy saved was very small, but if I remember correctly, the peak load declined by something like 2%, if I'm not wrong. It was not an insignificant number. But when the consultation occurred, almost everybody said that they did not want a change. We should just, whoever wanted could change working hours. I remember the two northeastern states which provided written submissions said that we have Bagan time, and that is good enough to take care of the problem. But I'm glad that you mentioned this. The struggle continues.
Now we open up the house for questions. I see the hand of Hemant Singh, followed by Tanumai, and Shrey. So
can we take the three questions together and then?
That would be nice. Hemant first, Tanumai second, and Shrey third. Please, your questions be as brief as possible, to the point.
Sir, so am I audible?
Yes, you are. Slightly on the lower side, but yes, you're audible.
Yeah, so we're having this sustainability session for like last 4 days, and I was reading about it, and there was a statement I came across, and you are the best person, so I will read it for you. It is by the IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. They estimated that there will be around 78 million metric tons of waste by 2050 because of solar panels. And the 90% of solar panels are made up of glasses, and that is not recyclable. So how are we gonna, are we just delaying our waste, or is there any way we can face it, solve it?
Okay, Tanmay?
Yeah. Good evening, sir. I have a twofold question. My first question is, currently we have a centralized energy system So do we see a decentralized energy system in India where microgrids could sell off their excess energy back to the grid? And my second question is, currently we have multiple forms of energy storage, say hydrogen fuel cells, like people are working on sodium ion cells, and we have lithium and battery cells as well. So like in future, do we see a hybrid kind of model where specific kind of energy storage is systems are used for specific cases, or like one particular energy storage system will dominate all? Thank you.
Thank you. Shay?
Good evening, Dr. Mathur. My name is Shrey. The question I wanted to ask is regarding the employment opportunities or the opportunities for the entrepreneurs in this entire ecosystem which the ISA is trying to develop. So if you can throw some light on that, as in the specific areas wherein, we the future managers or future entrepreneurs can come into play.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hemant, you have hit the nail on the head. If there is anything that will sound the death knell of the solar industry, it will be our inability to treat the solar wastes. Now, why is glass, or for that matter, even the solar panel consists of a lot of toxic materials, cadmium, arsenic, etc. What is needed? I can reuse them if somebody can give them back to me. The recycler can separate them if they are separable. Are they made that way? No, they are not. So I think the first issue is we need to have specifications that they are made in a manner that they are separable or dismantleable. Because whether it is a battery or whether it is a solar panel, if the materials are not separable, then recycling and reuse is not possible. So the ISA is in the process of putting out a program which looks at how we can create separable materials, how we can use separable technologies to produce cells and batteries. How do we collect them? Because even if they are separable, but they are in my plant and there is no way for them to go to the recycling plant, it's pointless. And what we are suggesting is that there is a fee charged upfront when it is sold, which goes into a fund which is then used to power the system. Then the recycling, where you have the capability to separate out the various things. And then, of course, the reuse, and possibly what that means is that there is a mandate that anybody who's making these must use X% of recycled material. So it's the entire chain that needs to be worked on as we go ahead. But you have hit the most important issue, which I believe is facing the solar industry. Tanmay, we have an increasing amount of microgrids in the country, but we have no idea of how to use them with the grid. And we have microgrids for two reasons. One is there were some existing microgrids that were there, and with the expansion of the grid system to every household in the country, those microgrids have been folded into the national grid, yet they work in isolation. The grid work, microgrid works separately, and the grid works separately. We need an integrated or an interoperable system. The second is there's a lot of emphasis on rooftop solar. Now, unless I use up all the electricity that I produce myself, I will sell some of it to the grid, which means I need an interconnected system. And the technology for it is very, very, very well understood. And in fact, both the technology as well as the bi-directional meters that are needed for them are now being put as a matter of fact in almost every state in the country, because almost every state in the country has what are called as net metering requirements, so that these rooftop grids, microgrids, can be connected to the main grid. Yet there are problems. In net metering, what happens is that the electricity company pays you for what you have bought at the same rate at which it charges for what you have bought. This the company says is grossly unfair because we generate at 4 rupees 50 paisa, but the time when we are selling it, it is buying electricity at a much lower rate because those are times when everybody is generating electricity during the day. So they say, the distribution company says, we should pay according to gross metering, which is what I paid to the electricity companies. But at that point, the consumer will not make any money. The guy who set up the solar plant. We need to balance their interests. We have been arguing that an average of net metering and gross metering rates is what is needed for this to take off. Regarding your question about batteries, this is an unanswered question right now. Batteries are still evolving. They are evolving in terms of their chemistries, they're evolving in the labs, they're evolving in various applications. So whether we will have one technology or we will have multiple technologies is not clear. It's not even clear, for example, in solar storage, what kind of technology would be used. It's not clear what kind of technology would be used in automobiles and for transport. This is a question that I think is still waiting for an answer. Shrey, your question about entrepreneurs and areas for development. There are clearly 3 areas. One is as a service provider. The number of companies, for example, which have come up as rooftop solar companies, which are providing electricity on a service basis. So they own the assets, they provide the electricity, and the buyer buys it from them. So in my previous job at the Energy and Resources Institute, we had set up a solar rooftop system, I don't know, 250 kilowatts, something of that sort. And this was installed by a third party, which was a startup. I think it was called Fourth Partner Energy, if I'm not wrong. And they owned the system, and we paid according to the kilowatt hours that we got at a given rate. And that rate was much, much less than the rate that we would have paid the electricity company if we bought from them. So this is one opportunity. Another opportunity that is coming up is in the area of automobiles, where we are looking at a battery changing environment. Now, no matter what kind of a battery changing environment it is, whether you walk, whether a consumer with a scooter or a car walks in and changes his batteries and moves out, or whether it is a charging station that we put, provides another set of opportunities, and solar charging of those chargers becomes an important issue. A third set of opportunities relates to the ability to provide solar electricity as a service, not as a service, as a commodity to grid companies. So this is the large solar plants. These are now in the hundreds of megawatts. But what happens is that periodically the electricity companies bring out bids. They ask for bids. They bring out tenders asking for bids for solar electricity to be supplied. 100% of the solar plants in India are in the private sector. A large fraction of them were set up by startups. Most of these startups have been acquired by larger companies as they've sought to achieve economies of scale. So, Shrey, there are many, many opportunities. In a sense, the sky is the limit as far as thinking about that stuff.
I don't know how we managed it, but we managed to even answer the question answers within the stipulated time. And that by itself is a major achievement. So this was certainly very, very fascinating, because this is one area that I think the world needs to look into. And the successful lobbying and the successful star ratings for air conditioners and refrigerators is something that all of us have seen. We have seen the gradual phasing out of even CFL by LED lights, which has played a major part. So yes, there are changes that are happening. And one area which probably is very interesting for all of us is the area of biomimicry, because every leaf in a tree is a solar panel.
Yeah.
And the way they have achieved producing electricity or energy for the tree is something which may be replicated for humans to use. I don't know, that's something that we often talk about in the class. But it was certainly delightful, sir. We are very, very grateful to you for having spared the time to be with us. As a mark of our respect, as a mark of the happiness that we had in sharing, you sharing your time with us, we planted a sapling in your honor.
Thank you very much.
So this is the sapling, and this is the plaque, sir. Thank you very much. So whenever you visit Shillong, you'll be also able to see
this gives me yet another reason to visit Shillong soon.
You must. So we look forward to your visit, and thank you very much. This was a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy. Any last words, please?
Thank you very much on behalf of Suscon, on behalf of IIM Shillong, sir, and for sharing your valuable time and sharing your precious insights with our students, our entire IIM Shillong community. And we are inspired, we are delighted, we are honored. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
It's just 7 o'clock.
Right, exactly 7.
My friend, Dr. Mike Thompson. Are you there, sir?
Yes, he's there.
I am indeed, Professor Sanjoy. A great pleasure to be with you all.
Honor and delight, Mike.
Calling in from the UK, in London.
Yeah.
Thank you. We are delighted to have you with us, though virtually, and we look forward to having you in person sometime in the future.
I want to come. I keep getting invitations by Sanjoy, and I will come one day. I'm a bit concerned for all our wonderful participants that they've already had a wonderful feast. I wonder whether they might like to rest their brains and stand up and jump up and down. If you were all in my class, I'd be getting you to, wander around, jump up and down, stretch, have a break, because you need a break, don't you? I don't know, Sanjoy, if they're allowed to have a break.
We have been allowing them a fair amount of break in between. It could be more, but yes, we are not doing too badly, I guess.
Just before the last session, they had a 1-hour break.
Okay, all right.
And Mike, let me introduce the person who was speaking just right now is Professor Sanjeev Kakoti, the co-chairperson of this conference, one of the pioneers of the sustainability movement in IIM Shillong, with multiple hats on his head, and we'll talk about it later. So I thought that you must know him, before we start.
Thank you. Great to meet you.
Thank you. Friends are always generous, so you better not believe all that he says. Now I'd like to invite again my friend Sanjoy to give a brief introduction of the speaker before we actually start the session.
Give me a minute,
Sanjoy,
please. Give me a minute, please.
Yes.
Could you also let me share my screen, please, Sanjoy?
Yeah.
Yes, you can. You can. Yes.
Good. Thank you.
So, yes, the speaker, my old friend, Dr. Mike Thompson, is an adjunct professor at Gustavson School of Business, University of Victoria, and was formerly a professor of management practice at the China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai, where he was director of the Euro-China Center for Responsibility and Leadership. And that's where I met him. That was 2012, I remember. His research focus has been on wisdom and leadership, published in various journals and books. He has recently co-edited with Laszlo Zonlai, whom you heard yesterday, the book Responsible Research for Better Business, published from Palgrave in 2020. Dr. Thompson has worked on the boards of entrepreneurial companies throughout his career in the UK and in China. He was the CEO of Good Brand, the international innovation consultancy until its acquisition by Antithesis in 2019. Anthesis in 2019. He's also a co-founder of Impact Hub King's Cross London. I think he's speaking from there. And also GLO, Good Leaders Online, Shanghai and Brussels. So friends, that's our speaker today, this evening, Dr. Mike Thompson. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sanjoy, and thank you to each one of you for keeping going through what looks like an exciting and very full conference. It's a great pleasure to join you here from London in sunny UK, and I have many good connections with India and many friends, so it's a real joy to be with each one of you. Before I start, can I just check that you can all see my screen correctly, because I've got a different view to you and I haven't got another screen. Can you just see a straight slide that says towards?
Yes, it is perfect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, good, because I've got a lot of other things happening in this as well. But wonderful to be with you. The title that I've agreed for the Suscon 8th International Conference on Sustainability is I suppose a long-standing theme of mine, and I'd hope that we can maybe take some breaks as I go, and you can feel free to ask some questions or make some comments. So I haven't got the chat option up, but if the chat option is available, then please do make any comments or questions, and I will take some pauses as we go so that you might be able to then have some opportunities to ask questions. So I'll lead off really with giving you, I suppose, the outline of what I want to cover. Three main areas that I think fall into this whole thing of towards conscious capitalism, but making a link to the conference theme, in which we're all here as spiritual beings as well as sort of physical beings, all together as humanity, looking for how we might bring hope to a rather troubled world through each of our lives in holism, harmony and happiness. And part of that is for us, I think, to navigate a way through capitalism as a dominant economic force of our time, and how we might creatively use capitalism to promote holism, harmony and happiness. So that's the backdrop really to the three topics that I want to cover in this, which is questioning capitalism, when we look at the kind of capitalist models and market models that are there. And then just to start talking about what conscious capitalism is, could be, and is already showing signs of being. And then thirdly, a concept that I think helps, certainly from an investor's point of view. I don't know how many of you are involved in finance, maybe studying finance, but I work with finance people and investors, and how we square the investment portfolio and demands to the real need to save our planet and bring social justice where there is injustice, which I think lies behind conscious capitalism, and the issues of justice and fairness in how we use our economic resources and how we use our talents lies behind the creation of hope for holism, harmony and happiness. So let me kick off with questioning capitalism as the first area. And really, I guess we all live in a time where there's a lot of debate about the justice or effectiveness or even continued utility of the capitalist economic system. Now, I say that because I think we're facing calls that talk about the exploitation of globalization, companies offshoring expense items to lower cost economies, greater transparency of the implications of that when we see decisions made at a head office affecting the ordinary lives of people in different parts of the world caught up in a supply chain, or it's suffering as a result of financial decisions being made and then having a global impact. So there's a globalization effect. There's also, I think, an increasing profile through social media commentating and regular news talking about companies or individuals who seem to be exploiting systems for their own personal greed and gain beyond what is reasonable. I mean, I think a reasonable gain people don't argue with, but when there's an unreasonable, unfair, corrupt form, then there's a moral response that we feel. And often capitalism is blamed as the system that allows people to be exploitative. The other area, I guess, is in the financialization of entire industries, where often it's perceived that investors are so far away and removed from the actuality of running businesses that they're not really interested. They're almost playing a casino. And casino investing is seen to be part of that challenge. The other area is really about externalities, and increasingly we see the need in conscious capitalism to bring externalities, the effect of private enterprise on public sector or civil society. And we saw that most shockingly in the financial crisis, when externalities really were taken on, were removed from any sense of enterprise or moral concern for decisions that we're making behind that crisis. So I guess since that meltdown of 2008, I think many of us have tried to learn lessons. And politicians and governments have looked at how companies, trade and industry can both balance a legitimate need for private investors and owners to feel that they're being rewarded for their time, their labor, their money, but not at the expense and not at the exploitation of those who are less privileged, less advantaged, and are at the end of exploitation. Notwithstanding also the huge demands of the climate crisis that faces us. So increasingly, the common theme has emerged through thought leaders that we need to rediscover, if you like, or reprioritize what is the higher purpose of capitalism beyond financial enrichment. How can capitalism be better used to become more of a solution than a problem in creating prosperity that's not just financial, but is social, that is spiritual, that is environmental? And how might we reorientate business and encourage new business enterprises to start in places like here in London at the Hub, where we support new enterprises that have a social purpose? And how might we use these as problem solvers, and rather than just simply creating vehicles for shareholder returns? Now, I'm going to just move on to just talk a little bit about capitalism here by giving you a few sort of quotes and snippets. This is a very important article from 2014 in McKinsey Quarterly, in which McKinsey was showing signs of 2014 reflecting their own work with business in responding to this sense that capitalism is under attack. And in real need of reformation. And I guess what we are now seeing is signs of that reformation, and I want to look at that further. In this particular article, Eric Beinhocker and Nick Hanoyer say that, and this is a kind of, I suppose, a neat summary of the way in which the story of neoclassical economics has produced a capitalist model that has now become somewhat outdated and certainly questionable. You can see here the quote where they talk about, in this article, a rather mechanistic view of capitalism, as though there's no human being is involved, that markets and prices are just involved in some objective, efficient allocation of resources, with rational, self-interested firms maximizing profits, rational, self-interested consumers maximizing their utility, and all this is to drive supply. Demand meets supply. Prices are therefore set between demand and supply. The market clears, and resources are then supposedly allocated in a socially optimal way. Now, I'm going to go and talk at strawman capitalism in it because I think what we've got here is a definition of capitalism that it has become something. I want to be careful here. I want to outline a critique of what I call strawman capitalism. Now, let me explain this. I guess that in the midst of legitimate criticisms of capitalism as a model, before we turn to conscious capitalism, is to say that in the end, it's a means of exchange that can be used for good or for ill, according to the operators of the system. Now, I'll be ready to take comments and critiques from that statement, because I know it's a little bit contentious, but let me go a little bit further to say that I think strawman capitalism is almost a set-up job of theory, of neoclassical theory, or if you like, positive economics, in with Homo economicus at the center. Homo economicus is the rational man that or woman that makes all these decisions to maximize their personal utility, etc. But there are a number of books that have been quite popular entering the market, really, I suppose, purporting strawman capitalism as everybody fears what's going to happen in the world through climate change. And I'm particularly thinking of, for example, Kate Raworth's book on donut economics, which is highly critical about sort of the so-called efficient markets, the state, the role of the state, etc. But also Eve Poole, and I'll turn to her in a moment, Eve Poole and her work on capitalism, denouncing capitalism as toxic, is another example of books that are out to pillory capitalism and create new models. Now, in fact, you could say, well, what we're talking about today is about creating a new model. But I think we have to create a new model that is evidently workable with the markets and the capitalist system that we have. Idealistically, we can come up with many different versions, but strawman capitalism strikes me as being a means by which you can attack capitalism, which comes down to this theory that I don't think many of us really subscribe to. And I speak for many different CEOs and businesses, investors who say, well, of course, there's no such thing as wealth maximization. It's all a theoretical model. So when you put up a book like this by Eve Poole, the toxic assumptions that she depicts from, if you like, the rational Homo economicus model is all about a theory rather than, I think, the practice of capitalism. But let me just give you her 7 points, because I want just to illustrate what I mean by what I think is strawman capitalism, which is effectively an attack on a theory rather than a description of reality. So she talks about the cancerous big idea of capitalism, and I'll be stopping in 5 minutes just for a break for you to ask some questions. Here, she says competition is one area. It's a cancerous big idea of capitalism, and in fact the book goes on to talk about cooperation, that really cooperation is much more efficient and effective. I'm going to hold back my comment, but just give it to you. The invisible hand, which he says is supposed to amazingly allocate resources in a fair and efficient way. She criticizes that. And of course, there's a backdrop to that with Adam Smith's work. But I'm afraid has misused Adam Smith's work, because he's written also the theory of moral sentiments as well as the wealth of nations, as you might know. One is really about having real empathy for people, what he calls sympathy, as well as looking at efficiency of markets. The third sin, if you like, she points to is the concept of utility. This is back to Homo economicus, the economic man, economic woman, who is out to maximize their own personal self-interest at the expense of anyone else. They don't care about anyone else. They're only ever going to maximize their own personal efficiency. And of course, there's some truth in that, but when it's exaggerated to a point, it becomes strawman capitalism. Agency theory, Eve Poole takes that apart. Agency theory, the relationship between owner and manager, as though the owners have all sway and power. The managers are just pawns that have to, heed what the big owners say. And of course, there's elements of truth in all of this. market pricing. She critiques supremacy of the shareholder, legitimacy of the limited liability model. You get the gist. So we have this idea of a system that has many different elements to it, but I don't think any system can unpick the myriad of motivations that different consumers and investors make in their individual transactional decisions. And certainly how many of you, when you're out buying or making choices, are rationally working out the utility that you will be gaining by buying one shampoo with a different bottle to another one, and looking at the ingredients, looking at what that will do, thinking about your personal beauty and the effect of this product on you. How many of us really do that? But if we're to be following the theory, every decision you make economically would have to be a rational one that you've considered it with all the facts. So you begin to see that when you set up this neoclassical model, it doesn't work. And of course, behavioral economists today, of course, we all know that. I mean, there is a place, and it'd be good for some commentary on that, for models of positive economics, but just almost to say, well, theoretically, this is the situation, but in practice, this is how people behave. And that's what we call behavioral economics. And it's the other thing about this rational economic woman or man is that it doesn't explain goodness beyond self-interest. So here we are gathered around an agenda talking about wholeness, harmony, and happiness. But the rational economic man doesn't make any economic sense of that. There is no ability to engage with that topic because where's my utility? Where's my personal utility if I start investing in wholeness, harmony, and happiness for everyone else? As a rational economic man, I only want to know what's going to give me harmony and happiness. I don't care about anyone else. So I'm just pillorying and showing you why I think the theoretical model is strawman capitalism. The way it's portrayed by some of these books is strawman. And I want to distinguish, as I go on in my argument, between capitalism as a method of exchange for wealth creation, which we can argue, I think that's a morally neutral thing. If I sell my labor to someone, they give me a return. If I lend them my money, I hopefully will get a return, and they get the benefit of using that money for whatever they want to do. So there's an exchange, which you can call capitalistic. But there is this other form of capitalism, but it's been redrawn by neoclassical economic theory, which has overlaid capitalism with this rationalistic, self-interested model that has failed, that fails to do justice to justice or responsibility or the well-being of all. And unfortunately, neoclassical economics and the widespread belief in the notion of profit or personal utility, maximization, is a model of capitalism readily to be attacked. I think we'd all want to attack and reject it, but that model has been widely rejected by economists over the decades, like Johannesson, Amartya Sen, Tversky and Kahneman, Brown, plenty of others. I'm going to stop for a moment and just give you all a chance. I don't know, Sanjoy, if you could manage this, so that if there are any comments or questions, I'm happy to, throw the floor open, as it were, for a moment or two.
So if I get a chance to ask, I want to know more about this invisible hand.
More about the invisible hand.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the concept of the invisible hand comes from The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith in 1776, which was a book that I suppose, is the beginnings, or at least in Western thinking, and I have to say that very carefully because, in Western models of how wealth creation happened, it was Adam Smith that began to try and describe a market. And the book, The Wealth of the Nations, lays out, if you like, how markets work and motivations for people. And the invisible hand is used or misused to say that actually resources are allocated by a supply and demand and you can't see this hand at work. It's just the way in which prices are determined as a result of supply and demand, and therefore resources are allocated to different people, both financial resources, land resources, capital is allocated according to the way in which I trade my gifts into this marketplace and get a return. So the invisible hand is this kind of allocation of resources, which is seen to be the sort of central point of market systems. Now, the context of what he's talking about is not actually in the way that it's applied. Now, I'd have to come back to you on the actual page on it, but when I looked into it, and certainly there's some work done by David Verheyen and Patricia, and they let me just tell you a comment they make about this invisible hand, if I can put my hands on it for you, because he didn't mean it to mean as though in an uncaring, rationalistic way. And he makes that clear in his other work that I referred to, which came a year or two later, which was the theory of moral sentiments, in which he tried to explain that actually we do have a sympathy with someone. When we see suffering, we feel that suffering. He used the word sympathy. In English today, we use more the word empathy. And he says, if we see suffering, we feel it. Now, his point there was saying, therefore, that affects the way in which we use our money and resources. Now, that's quite different from talking about an interpretation of an invisible hand, which is some objective mechanism that's got no heart, soul, or care. And so that invisible hand has been one of the sort of carryover sort of disclosures of sort of pricing and market mechanism. I can't lay my hand on the quote at the moment, but if I do, I will let you have it later. Is there any other comment or question before I continue? Is there anything I've said that you'd like to clarify, anyone? Any thoughts, anything that you'd like to add? It's all quiet, so I'm presuming.
Thank you, sir.
I can't see you all. I presume that you're all there, but I will press on. But Sanjay, do feel free to sort of stop me as I go if you feel like, you want anything clarified. I just want to press on a little bit here to talk about how I think the straw man capitalism model that we've referred to fails to acknowledge a relationship between human freedom and regulated capitalism in mixed economies. So what I mean by regulated capitalism is that actually in a lot of our economies, and I think this is true in India too, that actually the market isn't left to just do what it wants, because society exercises constraints by taxation, by the way in which rules and laws are regulating, ideally to protect human freedom and to protect exploitation. And I've got this little index here for you. I don't know if you've heard of the Human Freedom Index, but it's published, I think, every year, which is the measurement of personal, civil and economic freedoms across the world by country. So every country, it's got different rankings and how they measure human freedom. What interests me here is that human freedom and the measures for it to encompass personal, civic and economic freedom are fundamentally economic. So the four economic areas that are used to help define human freedom are actually capitalistic. So you've got, for example, measures on the quality of a legal system in the protection of property rights, how people can access sound money in a fair way, how a country, how free are you as a business person to trade internationally, what quality of regulation over credit, labor and business are there. So these are all economic orientated, legal orientated models that are needed for a system of exchange that is required in capitalism. So in its very basic form, it shows, I think, a neutrality in capitalism. And the question that we all go on to say is, given there's this basic exchange of, well, we all want sound money and freedom to trade, etc., how do we overlay that with a conscience so that capitalism can be used for good, a force for good in the world, as opposed to a force for bad? So these four economic areas are used for freedom. Let me move on to another and final area under questioning capitalism, which is shareholder primacy, which is the theory that shareholders are the controlling overview force of companies. Now, I'm a director of two companies, and neither of them are listed. If you are a director of a listed company, then the obligations, governance obligations differ. But essentially, you as a shareholder or as an owner actually don't own the company. Not a lot of people know this, but it's very important because we all think, well, the shareholders are all powerful, they can drive what they want. Now, they are a voice and they supply money, but they are not owning the company, they own a share, and that gives them the right to vote in an annual general meeting, and it gives them the right to be paid a dividend if the company is profitable. But beyond that, they are the bottom of the list if the company goes under for payment. So all debtors, other debtors, get paid before a shareholder. The shareholder can't just say, hang on, this is my money, I'm going to get my money, I don't care about anyone else. No, in all forms of mainstream corporate governance, and there was a time when I did look at Indian corporate governance. I hope there's people out there that can put me right if I'm wrong, but the similar principle is there, that shareholders' rights are limited, and in law, a company has its own legal identity. It's a company owns its own assets. The company is at a nexus of contracts, and it has its own legal representatives. The management and the board of management of a company stand in law in place of the company. So managers, whilst they have to, of course, take on board, how are they going to keep money coming into the company? Therefore, they need to please shareholders, they need to please the banks. But that's good practice. They need to show that they're doing a good job looking after the business. And if they do that, shareholders will invest, banks will lend the money, and they can carry on for the good of all stakeholders. But any manager or board director who doesn't comply with company law requirements in India or in the UK are liable for dismissal, as well as civil or criminal penalties. Now, whether that's specified in the company's governance documents or not, a company's management must aim for long-term success to balance the competing demands of different stakeholders, not just shareholders. I mean, you don't survive in a company if you don't care about your suppliers, your employers, and so on. So the shareholder voices are expressed via a general meeting. The chair of the board must respond to that, but similarly, the chair of the board and the board must respond to stakeholder demands, because if they don't do that, well, the company is at risk. Now, just a quick example of why shareholder primacy is not primacy really anymore, if it ever was. The US Business Roundtable updated their statement on the purpose of a corporation a couple of years ago. And they explicitly say that they, in doing that, are moving away from shareholder primacy. And that was a commitment made by 181 CEOs to lead their companies for the benefit of all stakeholders. Now, we can point to failures by some of these companies in not living up to what they want, but the fact that they've put their names to something that says, look, we've got to take care of all stakeholders, not just shareholders, is a sign of how I think there is a beginning of a conscious, or an expression of a conscience on the role and responsibility of a business and the role and responsibility of managing capitalism fairly, notwithstanding the huge dilemmas that these big companies face when they make mistakes in not listening to workers' safety concerns, as in Walnut, or not providing sufficient pay, sick leave, etc. All these debates will carry on. But if they're carried on against a background in which stakeholder-related goals are there as well as shareholders, then that's a good sign, I would suggest, of responsibility by management using capitalism to take care. At the same time, their management is faced with huge challenges. They still need to generate working capital and cash in a company. They need to continue to operate and meet profit objectives, because profit is just a measure of the success of the company, certainly not an end in itself, because interestingly, only 7% of Fortune 500 CEOs believe their company should mainly focus on making profits and not be distracted by social goals. Only 7% of CEOs would admit to that. Now you can say, well, they've got a long way to go, and I'm sure that they have. But what I want to point out to is this movement and this drift that we see away from neoclassical descriptions of how capitalism works, and its association with all that's unethical in the creation and distribution of goods and wealth. Now, responsibility for greed, fraud, criminality, despotic exploitations of competitive markets at the expense of society lie with moral agents, not with the mechanism of exchange. It's the moral agents. So this comes back to the spiritual drives that each person has to use their gifts and talents for good or for bad. And it's egoism and fear that often are the forces that are at work using a mechanism of exchange for ill-gained purposes. But let's bear in mind that the separate legal personality of a company is a basic tenet on company law, and it's not new. It was established in 1897 in the case of Solomon versus Solomon. That may be something that anybody wants to come back to me on, or just send a note to Professor Sanjoy, and he can stop me. But I'll just move on to the concept of conscious capitalism, having looked at questioning capitalism. And here's somebody that is a great inspiration for me, because when you talk about conscious capitalism, I begin to think about, well, what happened to me that made me interested in using business for good? And I credit Ryuazaburo Kaku, who was formerly the president, chairman, and chief executive of Canon from 1977 to 1999. And he had a fantastic vision for what companies could do in the world that didn't match, if you like, the neoclassical models of capitalism. And so in a very important article in the Harvard Business Review in 1997, I read this and I was, I suppose, enlightened, envisioned, and thought, that's it. He lays out how he had developed Canon at that point across different levels of development, not having reached his final level, which I'll come to in a moment. But he asked this question, how many have asked, can global corporations promote peace and prosperity and at the same time remain true to their obligations to secure a profit? So here's our dilemma, folks. For survival, a company needs to make a profit. It's the means by which it measures its efficiency, and if it's not making a profit, it hasn't got working capital, its cash dries up, and it can't pay its bills. That's the hard and fast rule. And I've been involved in forming a company in China. I've been involved in talking to people, companies, different parts of the world. It comes down to that. We need enough cash in our business, and profit is one of the marks that we generate the cash. What we do with any surplus cash is another question. So we have to secure a profit, but how, he said, can global corporations promote peace and prosperity at the same time? Well, his answer to the question was this: Kyosi. Kyosi is the answer to this question. And he defined Kyosi as a spirit of cooperation in which individuals and organizations live and work together for the common good. So it's a wonderful vision, because if you think of the conference theme of holism, harmony, and happiness, that the ideal of the common good is that all of us, the commonness is the holism for all our being, spirit, soul, and body, for all of humanity, holism for good, the common good. And it's a spirit of cooperation, not just between individuals, but between companies to establish harmonious relationships, he said. Again, you know, this theme of harmony. He said, practicing Kyosi, you're out to cooperate, basically. And he says a company that's practicing Kyosi establishes harmonious relationships with its customers, its suppliers, its competitors, and the government. And harmony and cooperation for the common good flows from this meaning of Kyosi, which is a sort of symbiosis, this balancing between, as you say, the profit and the cooperation that comes in spiritual terms from the love of neighbor, which has got a deep Buddhist background to it. Though it was taken on by some Western economists as well in taking us into what happiness, justice, and cooperation could look like by tempering individual, organizational, and national self-interests, by looking at the common good and the common goods as tempering personal ideals for gain and at the expense of others. So he's an inspiration for me when I come to conscious capitalism. And he said this in conclusion at the end of his article, which was the ultimate high point, which it would be wonderful for us to think, well, isn't this toward conscious capitalism? If corporations run their businesses with the sole aim of gaining more market share or earning more profits, they may well lead the world into economic, environmental, and social ruin. But if they work together in a spirit of Kyosi, they can bring food to the poor, peace to war-torn areas, and renewal to the natural world. And it's our obligation as business leaders to join together to build a foundation for world peace and prosperity. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. Can you go into your world with that kind of vision, that you can decide, I'm going to act in the spirit of Kyosi, so that whatever my work is, I want it to somehow have impact in a positive way, so that the business or the commercial enterprise that I have can help towards world peace and prosperity. Better to live with that vision than to live with some of the disastrous stories that surround us each day. And that's conscious capitalism for me. Now, there are other expressions of conscious capitalism, and in fact, explicitly, the term has been used by John Mackey. I'm not sure if John Mackey is known in India, but he was the co-founder and CEO of Whole Foods Market, the natural and organic grocer, and it's a $13 billion Fortune 500 company. So this is, you know, one big company with more than 370 stores, 80,000 team members, a big online business in 3 countries. And it's been voted best company to work for 16 consecutive years. And he said this with Raj Sisodia in a book that was published some years back. Ultimately, conscious business creates lasting value as the world evolves to even greater levels of prosperity, helping billions of people flourish and lead lives infused with passion, purpose, love, and creativity. A world of freedom, harmony, prosperity, and compassion. So the title of my talk is Towards Conscious Capitalism, but ultimately, if we get conscious capitalism or conscious business with using business for good, then can we create a world of freedom, harmony, prosperity, and compassion? Because it's we as individual moral agents that are at work in the exchange system. It's not an invisible hand over which we've got no control. Let me just pause for a moment, Professor Sanjoy. If there's any comment or question or anything, let me just pause for a moment.
I was thinking, I'm not sure about students have raised hands, but I was just thinking aloud with you, you know, does it have any bearing with a different look at economics as had been promulgated by our Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen?
Yes.
By any, if could you just help the students to connect a little bit on that.
Yes, Amartya Sen is also another hero of mine, and of course is a prolific writer. He's written a book on justice recently, which is, I suppose, a response to John Rawls' justice, the distribution theories of justice. So he's somebody that's got a very sharp mind on questions of justice, but he's also a fine economist. And when you combine justice with economics, it's a wonderful result. And part of the result, he wrote a book called something like Foolish. Was it? Someone will help me. Basically, it's about the model of Homo economicus, rational fools, it's called, and. And that's just as an example of his work. Homo economicus is a rational fool, and doesn't bear any resemblance to the reality of what we all face. And I can see that Sanskruti. Sorry if I haven't got the name. Just ask a question, Sanskruti.
Hi, Mike. So I had a view on how conscious capitalism works, and it's a new concept for me. However, I'm quite confused with socialism right now, because conscious capitalism is not something that an economy can adopt. Because if all the businesses wouldn't want to adopt it, only few businesses will think about it. And if all the business has to adopt it, then the government has to intervene. And if the government has to intervene, it's not capitalism anymore, it's socialism. So how does it work on an economy level?
Right. So I didn't quite catch everything, but if I get your drift, you're basically saying, well, if we're following this sort of conscious of capitalism, it feels more like socialism and not capitalism. Is that what your question is?
Yes.
Yes.
Adding on,
Yes.
conscious capitalism looks good for an individual business. It looks like a choice that a company should adopt it or not adopt it.
Yes. Now that's a very good question, and it actually primes me up for the last section. What I'm going to do is pause, but I will answer the question by what I'm going to go on to say, I think, if I may, which is really about how we can see the reality of investors forcing conscious capitalism. In other words, what we're going to see, and I might run out of time, but essentially the movement and the advance of what's called ESG investment, it's certainly here in Europe, particularly the UK, the investment market is absolutely, electric, with private equity investors buying up smaller companies, but insisting that due diligence is carried out on their environmental and social governance factors. Now, my company Anthesis, one of the things that we do is advise investors on a company that they're wanting to acquire by producing an ESG report, or another report called TCFD, which is also big in Europe, which is the Task Force for Disclosure of Carbon, where a company has to disclose all its carbon emissions, its waste materials, etc. So there is, and I'll come to this in a moment, the power behind this new form of conscious capitalism has been recently driven by investors. Now, then you got to ask the other question, well, why are so many investors now requiring due diligence reports when they never required them before? And if we get time before the end, then we can talk about that. But the short answer to the question is that socialism is a very different model, and it requires a planned economy, and if you take it in its extreme form, and we mixed economies mix, if you like, social causes with capitalism, but it's not quite the same as pure socialism. And what I'm purporting here is to say, look, the means of exchange of capitalism is, I would argue, morally neutral. The problem is with the exploitation that has carried on by individuals, and the reality of that is in the human heart, whether you've got a socialist model or a capitalist model. The issue is the greed and that we battle, which is like all of us have self-interest, but you can put self-interest, if it's pushed, becomes selfish and egoic. Now, that will lead me on to a point that I'm going to make in a minute. But I will return. It's a really good question, and I will try and fill out a little bit more. But I've got an eye on the time and see I've only got 12 minutes left. So I'll push on if I may. But thanks for the question. So the hope of conscious capitalism actually is about smart moral agents, not just the investors I've mentioned, but workers, managers, all working for a common good. Now, it's idealistic for some, but I think there's many people, and I told you just about investors, who are competing and leading in market sectors because they are enterprises that do well in demonstrating that they are seeking to contribute to society rather than on the downside. So the hope of conscious capitalism is the emergence of a new generation of moral agents, like all of you guys, and you could be the moral agents of sustainable enterprise. And I'm in a place here where we promote sustainable enterprise. That means companies that have a social or environmental impact as well as making money. You deploy technological, productive and innovative goods for the well-being of all. And you do it in the most efficient way possible. So profit is a motive, but it is not the only motive. We have many other motives for entering into business and engaging. And you can see that actually there are many narratives for conscious capitalism. There's a list of all sorts of writers. Perhaps the most well-known is Stakeholder Capitalism, which is Freeman started in 1984, which basically says a company's got to take care of all its stakeholders. Well, that's now mainstream. I mean, I'm working with investors. That's the norm. You absolutely need to have your suppliers on side, your workers and everything else. So inclusive capitalism, virtuous, is the idea of progressive business, which is Professor Lazar Solnay and Barbara Higgins, who I think Professor Solnay has already spoken in your conference, but the concepts of progressive business. And then at the end, you see Spironomics, which may not be so widely known, but it was of interest to me some years ago when I met S.K. Chakraborty, who really brought to life some of the traditional I suppose, human values associated with some of the great works of people like Sri Aurobindo and so on, and try to work those as an alternative Indian model of business to the Western models. Now, I think Professor Sanjoy hopefully at some point will be able to tell us later about the book that he is co-editing to give honor to Professor Chakraborty, who has passed not long ago. But here's a quote to give you a taste of Spironomics, in which he says, the goal of human self-transformation is to achieve human values in contrast to the preoccupation of what he called the body, life, mind, the BLM triad, which is the force of egoism and greed that underpins left brain management practices found on rationalist orthodoxy. Well, for me, that's all about the neoclassical economics that supposedly has shareholder maximization as king, and so on. So I'd love to spend more time, but you can look at his work, The Foundations of Managerial Work, first published in 1998, being republished, with infused philosophies associated with Atman, the spiritual essence which dwells in each one of us, draws from Indian sages over the ages, people like Sri Aurobindo and the unpurified heart and unpurified life and distortions and so on. So it's got a spiritual dimension, but it comes as a challenge to what Western management and business practices have developed over the years based on this BLM egoistic mindset, which he says must be subject to the development of a spiritual or higher self, and management needs to be unleashed from Western economic paradigms, this neoclassical economics, to find better pathways. So encourage you to look into the work of Spironomics and S.K. Chakraborty. I can't spend any more time because I want to end with the response to the question of total value creation, which is really how we observe investors and mainstream consulting firms such as McKinsey noting here in their article that environmental, social and governance issues become urgent and companies are looking to create both profit and progress. here's a model. These are the stakeholder influences that companies face. Consumers, many different influencers. At the center, there's the investors, and investors now, as I was saying earlier, the private equity investors invest, but they want ESG, that's environmental, social, governance indicators. And there's many different financial research agencies like MCSI, like Sustainalytics and so on, that provide data on every company based on objectively researched data, not what the company gives them, on their performance on a number of measures. And the measures classically are listed there under environmental, all the things to do with climate change and pollution, and how they look after the human rights, health and safety, governance, the way in which they manage their executive pay, what they're doing about tax and security. So a range of measures. Typically, a company could have anything between 250 and 500 indicators on those issues. And then big investors like BlackRock, one of the biggest investors, talks about this transformation through this ESG or sustainability dimension being added to investors' requirements. And they say that actually the investors are interesting because assets that are high sustainability are going to be rewarded because the assets will become more expensive, and those with low sustainability, the assets will become cheaper. So big investors like BlackRock are getting right behind this idea that you can create value through ESG. So my concept of total value creation refers to the value that you can create across multiple stakeholders and with company performance measured by ESG. And ESG data, despite their shortcomings, have become much more than negative or normative screening in the investment process, but a real tool for managers and investments to use. So there's a lot I'd love to say about that, but time's running away from me. But so let me just give you a model of total value creation, which I did some years ago, which shows that something like TVI is the total value index. What we did was we looked at a range of, I think probably about 200 or 300 companies, listed companies globally, and looked at their various corporate financial measures, market capitalization, revenue, EBITDA. We looked at their ESG ratings from data by Thomson Reuters, and we did a simple index and divided them by 2. We then ranked these companies by sector, and you can see what you can begin doing. Now, I'm just illustrating what investors would do with a concept of total value creation. You look at the financial performance, but you also look at ESG, because this indicates the future sustainable success of a company and potentially larger rewards. So there's a financial motivation as well as, if you like, a moral obligation and a response to stakeholder pressure through governments, through media, demanding attention. And certainly if you look at the net zero demands by government, these are often legal requirements now. So things like environmental, these are optional things. Many of them have become absolute requirements. Certainly the TCFD standard in Europe is one example of that. And BlackRock, as I've mentioned earlier, its largest asset manager, has now announced that it wants to make sure companies are adequately managing and disclosing sustainability related risks, and then holding them to account if they're not, and delisting them from being invested by BlackRock. And if you go to the BlackRock website, it will tell you the vote, if they voted against directors or boards, if BlackRock assessed that they're not making sufficient progress on integrating climate risk, for example, into their models. And they reported last year that they took voting action against 53 or 22% of their companies. They made voting actions to back up their requirement in a company's stakeholder engagement and climate risk mitigation, which they say is not philanthropic, but simply the fiduciary discipline necessary for a company. And here's Larry Fink when he says, well, actually, if you want a company to profit over time, then they must benefit all their stakeholders. So here, I think, whatever the motivation, we don't know, but there are signs that conscious capitalism is coming in force, because we don't just want economics, we want environmental, we want social, we want governance performance on companies. And if you don't get invested. And another sign of that, of course, is the B corporation movement that has flourished for not, it's now got over 4,000 companies worldwide. And of course, the requirement is that you change the Articles of Association to ensure that your purpose of operation is to serve all stakeholders. And B Corp will independently certify you against your standard. Is a very stringent pass-fail benchmark. I know that because here in the UK, Impact Hub King's Cross, where I speak to you from today, was one of the first companies that were listed. So there you go. This is now a B Corp. My other company, Anthesis, has also recently become a B Corp. So we find that B Corps have been proliferating based on a standard of independently assessing ESG reports. I could go on and talk about Danone, the Double Projet, which has now become a French entreprise à mission, to prioritize stakeholders in their decision-making. But I think it's come to an end. So I'm sorry that I've raced through the latter bit, but I suspect time is now up, Professor Sanjoy. So I will stop to say, very happy if you want the conversation to carry on separately by email, or feel free to carry on. But I do wish you all well in becoming great conscious capitalists, looking for the well-being of all through all that you're doing, making sure that the common good is there in governing your enterprise, and going beyond the fiduciary duty into really seeing how business can be used for the common good. Thank you.
Professor Kakuti.
Right. Thank you very much for a very, very elaborate presentation. And what you have done is you have touched at the base of the entire conversation, taking a deep, hard look at capitalism and trying to bring about different perspectives on how capitalism can work. Thank you very much. I'm sure it's going to provoke a lot of thinking and hopefully a lot of research. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sanjeev, and thank you all.
I have a special thanks to Mike, for mentioning here, the person with whom I had spent about 20 years of my life, Professor S.K. Chakraborty, whom we mentioned yesterday also, if you remember the students during the session with Bhaskar Basu and Sai Chandrasekhar and Atul Bihari Bhatnagar mentioned about him. And we have all been inspired by him. And the concept of spirinomics, which Mike highlighted, was very original by Dr. Chakraborty. Very few people know about him these days, but we are trying to honor him with a tribute volume coming out from Springer, where Mike, Laszlo, they have all contributed. And I'm sure somewhere in heaven, Dr. Chakraborty is smiling today. That yes, the Center for Human Values at IIM Calcutta is not so well functioning these days, but there are people around the world, across the world, in different parts of the world, who are being inspired by him and talking about him. So that's my special thanks to Dr. Mike Thompson, my old friend, and thank you very much for being with us and inspiring us. The last final pleasant duty on our behalf, Dr. Kakuti.
Right. So, but what we have done this time is that in order to honor and cherish the memories that you leave behind with your talk, is we have planted a sapling. We call it the sapling of hope in celebration of life. And this sapling is in your name, sir.
Thank you.
It is in our permanent campus.
Thank you.
We thank you for being with us, spending time, sharing ideas. And on your behalf, we have planted a sapling for you.
Thank you.
This is the token.
That is a great joy. I will share it with my family. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so
See
much.
you. Goodbye.
Yeah.
And
goodbye. Stay safe and healthy. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So with that, we come to the end of day 4 of the conference and the foundation module.
What an amazing journey, sir. I'm amazed. I don't know how to express that. I don't know how and Sanjay sir and you and all the committee members are able to get such a speakers which has covered the whole planet in terms of sustainability. It's an amazing thing, sir. Amazing.
It was
Thank you
all
so
been done
much.
with the help of God, and Sanjay has been the leader. We have just followed him.
Not at all, not at all, not at all. We have all done it. We have all done it.
So I'll be sending across a mail tomorrow. We have got something special. At 3:30, we have a cultural program being organized by the first year participants. So 3:30